putting it to the cloud because I don't want to burn up my computer. There you go. All right. Well, welcome everybody to our Serendipity space. This is a brainchild of our fantastic team, where what we realized was that having unstructured conversations often led to the most interesting solutions, and trying to have guiding questions and all of that stuff wasn't all that interesting, and just sort of bouncing ideas off of each other led to some very interesting conversations. That's the goal here. There's no agenda. There's nothing. If you have a burning question, throw that in there. Yeah, that's really what it is. So no particular agenda. So that said, I don't know. Does anybody want to kickstart? Does anybody have a burning question? And
Yeah,
ask
I mean,
the hard questions. Yeah,
yeah, I'd love to throw one.
Hard questions, yes.
Okay, I love hard questions. So my question sort of to everyone would be, we've just sort of been discussing within the group the purpose or the problems that come along with an ethical framework on AI. So whether that's such ethical guidelines being adopted by countries or organizations actually serve the purpose. So sort of ethical principles like, okay, create a sort of fair AI or equal AI, and whether those actually help that organization with governing AI, or does that pose a problem with being put into code, and should they actually sort of be there at all, and rather just be sort of tied to just the general sort of manual of an organization rather than ethical principles. So I guess the question is, do ethical principles in this way or guidelines serve their actual purpose for organizations?
I can jump in there on something quick. Like, the essential mode of how government regulations operate, it's twofold. One is the legislative component, the other is the administrative component. And so policy is that legislative component. It's saying, here's what we want. And in an ethereal aspect, what it does is kind of just give you a social norm, saying, here's what, as a democratic society, we expect people to do. But it holds very little punch beyond that. So that's really relying on people's goodwill and the social norm setting that occurs because of it. And oftentimes, especially in our current climate, where there is a lot of division in terms of what people think the society should do, and there's a lot of political factionism, policy takes a backstage to administration. And so really, in the climate that we're in, I do think that the ethical principles, while they're useful on a standpoint of we should have a guiding light, they don't do a lot in terms of encouraging people to obey them. And we have a pretty weak administrative system in terms of what it means to regulate a tech company and what they do. And there are different proposals on how to get around this. My favorite is from Gillian Hadfield and Jack Clark. So they're at OpenAI, and they proposed this idea of regulatory markets, basically saying, why not have private companies deal with the administrative task? So, because the government clearly knows what it wants, ideally, it may not, but it could know what it wants. And if it knows what it wants, the real challenge then is, how do we get people to comply? And that's just outside of the resources that a state currently has. And what's really important then is, how do we empower different actors to enforce these things? And so I think that's where the really interesting discussion is, like, how do we create that administrative apparatus?
How about asking for community audits of the companies? Like, as a community, why don't we ask them to show us an ethical audit, take a look at the data sets or something along that line? Will they allow us, or is like, it's just a far-fetched idea?
From my perspective, the community play is possible, but it requires a lot of scale and standardization. Like different members of the community might be looking for different things. And if that's the case, I don't think companies would want to give it to people, because they wouldn't have that trust that you're going to actually do something reliable or something that's beneficial for them. Like, a standardized rating system would be something that I think a lot of people would comply with. And in that frame, like, I do think, I remember speaking with Abhishek about this, like in many ways, I think like a company like PwC or Deloitte, like these large audit firms have the potential to like say, hey, give us a standardization metric, like tell us what we're looking for. And we have the scale and reputation to go in, look at it, give the accreditation, and then that kind of allows the community to get this information.
Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, Ryan, I hope whatever ends up with regulation ends up being outside of the current audit companies. just putting it out there. I'm coming from, you know, finance background, investment background, or HR by trade, but from investment banking and healthcare. Oh my God. Yeah, there's like so much conflict of interest. I mean, not to put any names against it, but history is open for every single audit company. And if you're already doing tax advisory and independent audits or Sarbanes-Oxley audits, etc., I think putting on top of algorithmic assessment or algorithmic auditing and just creates another revenue stream for those companies. I totally agree with you that there should be like a trusted entity who would be able to do that through standardization, but hopefully it's wider than, you know, just not only audit companies. It could include audit companies, but something that's wider.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's just like the reason why I gave it as an example is because it's like very hard to build that scale of corporation that can do that. And I feel like if it's a purely community initiative, it's probably not self-sustaining. Like one of the things that any effective algorithmic auditor needs to do is attract the quality of talent that can carry out this audit. And that means they need to be financially sustainable in some way. And so it has to be a corporate kind of auditor. Whether it's an existing auditor, yeah, like I agree, like there's a lot of problems with the existing auditors, but building a new auditor also requires like a lot of money. And so coming up with that business model becomes a really challenging thing. How do we build a company that can effectively audit?
Doesn't necessarily have to be a company, does it? It could be a independent or quasi-governmental agency.
Yeah, it can be a new community-led initiative, right? Like it can be an organization that the community has come up with, and I don't know how we will sustain it financially, but I haven't thought it that far, but it's like, it's an idea. So I'm like thinking there should be an audit of the companies because people are just doing whatever they want with our data and nobody is there to tell them not to. The laws are not doing that. In each country, it's different.
Yesterday we were having a conversation with different stakeholders on the Ontario's new alpha principles for AI. And somebody brought up during the conversation sort of the FDA and how it works to regulate pharmaceutical companies in the US. And they were sort of offering an FDA type model for regulating AI. And I was wondering what you guys' thoughts were on that, sort of like a model that could, you know, test not only AI systems in terms of like their reliability, accuracy, but also just their general effectiveness and whether or not they respect certain principles. So I was wondering if that was like a framework we should look into, or what are maybe some of the constraints of doing something like that?
I think the FDA model has been suggested by at least 3 different groups or people that I know of. Joy Blomany and Timnit being one, Frank Pasquale being the second, and I want to say maybe Sandvik or Mittelstan. I can't remember the third one, but I know I can probably figure out. Definitely, if that's what I was saying, that it doesn't have to be. I totally agree with what Ryan said in terms of the legislative and administrative stuff and having standards and probably risk-based, how do you say, assessment and ratings and assessing against that or auditing against that. There was a paper or report that just came out from the German Data Ethics Commission that was suggesting a very similar thing, kind of pushing it even further than European Commission's recent white paper. It needs to have good talent, capacity, as well as enforcement mechanism, and not become a revolving door between the big tech and big corporations and that agency as well.
Yeah, I think what Murph just ended there with, that's probably like the biggest risk of an FDA model. So FDA is like a historical model. It's really interesting because even like how it came out is essentially like what Susanna was suggesting. Like it began as a community-led initiative of people independently rating the quality of food products. And then as they tried to scale it, they just got incorporated and federated into a governmental agency. And at that point, you had a lot of talent come in. But one of the risks right now with an FDA model is there's been a trend over at least the last 30 years where it's really hard for governments to attract top talent into the civil service of any kind. And as a result, there's become this almost corporate capture of the FDA, where large pharmaceutical companies provide them with the regulatory tools to regulate themselves because you don't have the people in the FDA capable of doing that. And so the independence almost gets jeopardized because they can't viably keep that talent in. And that comes for all sorts of reasons. But one of the big reasons is just if you're a government agency and you're susceptible to government budgets and you're not able to finance yourself effectively, you finance yourself through the very companies you're trying to regulate. It's the same kind of stuff that happened in the financial crisis, right? And so that becomes a big worry with that.
So I think, one of the things where I see this being a little different from, suggesting maybe an FDA sort of mechanism is that the FDA was geared towards food, right? And drugs. So what's interesting there is that it's a very, quote unquote, narrowly defined domain that it has a clear scope. But for something like AI systems, which pervade all sorts of domains, having a single body it doesn't like work that well, right? I would almost say we would, instead of trying to create a new regulatory body, folding in capacity into existing bodies is a more effective mechanism, because then that helps you also address the question that Ryan brought up in terms of achieving scale, right? Where if we want to have scale, why not leverage existing mechanisms that already do have the reach, they have the respect, they have at least domain expertise. They maybe don't have, it's debatable in terms of, if they have, AI expertise or not, but at least they have domain expertise in terms of, if you're looking at, food ratings, or we're looking at, transport, or we're looking at finance, or we're looking at other sort of domains. They have the domain expertise in place, but it's a matter of then sourcing and channeling AI expertise into those places. Now, I don't have an answer to, how do you snatch them away from high-paying corporate jobs and transferring them or diverting them towards maybe not so well-paid civil services, but going towards having a new organization, I think, creates more redundancies and what I think I see as, fragmentation of the landscape rather than harmonizing existing efforts.
Yeah. Aniceto, did you want to say something?
Yes, I think it's instead of giving power to any new entity, probably the best solution is to expand current regulators to new capabilities in order to oversee the working of intelligent systems. So actually there is already an infrastructure, a regulating infrastructure like FDA, FTB, etc. So only is needed to expand their capabilities. But anyway, somebody has to check to certify the right working of those new systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting when we consider the FDA because we're sort of assuming that this serves as a useful use case or precedent, and that it's analogous to the circumstances that we're dealing with now as it relates to AI. But I think that there are fundamental discrepancies between the work being done with the FDA and what we really need in order to create a more ethical framework for the technology that we're now seeing emerge. I think chief among them is the FDA is sort of designed to determine that the food or the drugs or whatever it is that they're certifying will have a predictable impact on the human body. And that is quite fundamentally different from what we need in the field of AI, which is to assure us that for all different types of people, the technology being created will not work to disenfranchise them or be biased against them or all sorts of other things that that really require a more multi-stakeholder inclusive approach than just putting experts in charge of assessing whether this will have a predictable impact. So a different source of precedent that I've been looking at in other work has been the field of bioethics, which essentially they work to ensure that any experiments being conducted are being done in an ethical way. And they have a lot of decision-making power, and that's sort of done by creating these ethics review boards, or IRBs, at whatever institution is carrying out this research. And maybe that's another good approach. And the people that are sitting on the board aren't just experts, but also lay people that are being impacted by the experiment or the results of the experiments, but are in no way experts shaping or conducting the experiments themselves. So I think that's also a really interesting precedent that we might look to for a more effective regulation of this space. I don't know if anyone's heard of like the bioethics sphere as something to look at for precedent in AI. Have you?
I have not, but I was going to say, just going back to following up on Abhishek's comment that this is applicable to all sectors and industries is kind of overarching, that AI is overarching. There is some, and by the way, full disclosure, I'm writing a paper on this, so on governance and some suggestions, not like on a federal thing, but kind of a roadmap of soft governance and hard governance options. FTC and FCC in US actually has some responsibility, and it is within their remit to regulate some of this stuff. Look, FTC especially can regulate the stuff around Fair Credit Reporting Act, the data brokers, the tenant screening apps, anything that has to do with like hiring and EOC, algorithmic hiring, etc. Anything that has to do with eligibility to resources. So that might be a starting ground to create something that is overarching, is what I'm thinking. But also has connections to civil society. Alison, to your point, the connections to civil society and think tanks, etc. So there's a trusted body like that. I haven't looked at anything bioethics, but I'm kind of leaning on something that is going to impact all departments and all industries.
Very
Yeah,
cool.
just to follow up on that, because yeah, I totally agree with both Abhishek and Merv's point that essentially the problem with like thinking of the FDA is you're right, it is an industry focused thing. And I think the things to study to get a better understanding of AI, and I would even say that like I disagree that bioethics is the way to go about it, because bioethics again is somewhat narrow, and the ethics review boards review a much more limited set of things. Whereas if you have them empowered to do the kinds of things that it would require for an AI review, which like data science impacts almost every corporation and almost every decision they make, they would be very disempowered. And you get this kind of concern about ethics washing. A lot like Google had that, where their ethics review board for AI had a lot of people that weren't considered like stakeholder groups that were considered political stakeholder groups rather than actual legitimate stakeholder groups. And there's no way to like effectively monitor against that. But to Merv's point about like the FCC model, like I think things to study are domains such as how do we regulate discrimination in hiring practices? Because human resources is one of those things that every company has a human resource department. It typically gets a consultancy, provides for many corporations and develops standard practices. Accounting is one of those things that every corporation has an accounting department. You have standard practices and consultancies across organizations. And data analytics and AI is another one of those types of just basically internal foundational operations. And it has certain effects outside of the company. And there are other fields like that. And so I think accounting and human resources and law are kind of precedents on how we regulate cross-functional internal basic operations within corporations and take into account there's like societal effects. And all of them are obviously regulated in different ways. Like different bodies take over like reviewing human resources filings, like that's employment and labor, versus like accounting, like the SEC would probably look at that. And they operate differently, but each of them provides lessons on what it means to operate and what it means to regulate a certain type of foundational approach.
No, yeah, those are great points, and I think it's what I expected would happen in the session, is that we would probably have so many interesting points of discussion. We would again run out of time. But this was great. I don't know how you guys felt about it, but I think we started in one place, but we had the opportunity to talk about a lot of different areas, and I really appreciated, I think, a lot of the points that were brought up. And of course, as is always the case, we end up raising quite a few questions. As we answer some, we raise more. But this is what this is about, is, you know, asking the hard questions. I think that's what we really wanted to do with the serendipity space. I think this was fantastic. I really appreciate that, well, you guys consented to recording it, because I think a lot of the points that we raised here will be worthwhile for the larger community to also discuss and also, you know, provide inputs on this as well. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time with your lunch hours or your snack hours, wherever in the world you're joining us from. I know it's late here in India, so it's past dinner hour for me. But this was fantastic. You know, as one of the core pillars of the work that we do at the Montreal AI Institute, it's really about the community. So it's really about you guys tuning in, joining in to the conversation. So I appreciate it. We'll see you back here, well, for our next session, our next meetup happening on the UNESCO AI Ethics Principles. That's taking place on the 29th. So join in for that. If not, we'll see you back here in the serendipity space in a couple of weeks. Well, all I can say is stay safe and healthy. I really enjoyed the discussion and hope to see you guys soon again. All right.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Abhishek.
Awesome.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.